And one more time, welcome back. We are at chapter 13 for this video. This is our psychosocial development in middle childhood. We are going to start here on slide number 5, the nature of school-age children. And basically between the ages of 6-ish and 11-ish, kids are starting to attempt to master kind of culturally valued skills and interactions. They're developing a sense of themselves, and certainly by the end of this middle childhood period, you'll start seeing a certain amount of self-awareness and self-efficacy that, I have different thoughts than you, and my thoughts have right. Even, you've been saying that they're wrong all the time. They're learning how to care for themselves, but also to kind of stand up for themselves. And so this is why you see kind of at that pre-adolescent stage where kids will say, will argue just basically for the sake of arguing, recognizing that they have this sort of autonomy within themselves. Moving on to slide number 7, we see Erikson's next stage. So here is the industry versus inferiority. This is the 4th psychosocial crisis, and basically it's this tension between productivity and incompetence. And if that seems similar to some of the previous issues that we have had with these psychosocial crises, it is. But now at this point, kids are entering school, they're starting to do things around their peers. And so when they're doing these things, they're also connecting it to other people. How am I doing compared to this person? How am I doing compared to this person? And we develop this new ability now that we are in school to not only compare ourselves to this one other person that we want to be like or be better than, but to compare ourselves to everyone. And so I can compare my running ability to that person who runs really well, and my math ability to that person who does math very well, and my poetry ability to that person who writes poetry very well. And if I'm doing it in this way, what I'm doing is setting myself up to be incompetent and inferior to everyone else around me by basically cherry picking other people's strongest abilities and comparing it against my own, rather than looking at the whole body of a person, everybody having their own strengths and weaknesses, including me, including that person who's great with running, and that person who's great with math, and that person who's great with poetry. And so this starts to become kind of like a social judgment, even though it's still a judgment within ourselves. When we do things, do we feel proud and accomplished? Do we recognize that we have strengths and weaknesses and that's okay? Or do we focus on the weaknesses? Or do we focus only on the strengths? And that sort of thing. Within Freudian development, the psychosexual stages, it's latency. As far as I can tell, Freud just didn't know what was happening in terms of our sexual development during this stage, so he said nothing. So we'll move on to the next piece for that. Our self-concept, as I mentioned, this is on slide number 8, is becoming more specific, more logical, but is also starting to have that social interaction where we're able to compare ourselves negatively to lots of other people, and there's a lot of like peer influences, and especially moving toward middle childhood, toward pre-adolescence and into adolescence, like kids can be awful, and when folks are exposed to that sort of awfulness, it can be very difficult to challenging, damaging even to one's self-esteem. On slide 9, we see our social comparison, and again, this can lead to very high increase in self-criticism and self-consciousness. We might also see materialism increase. Not only are kids becoming more aware of their social environment and sort of their and meaning their peers, but they're also becoming aware of their cultural environment. So what do we see on TV? What do we see on media? How do my peers exemplify these things that I am seeing on media? So this person has these clothes and these items, and therefore they're cool because the people on TV who have these clothes and these items are very cool. And so we can see that kind of starting to manifest. Another part of this, or maybe a counterpoint to it, is this effortful control, which is getting much better the more we move toward middle childhood. We are far from the tantrums of the 2-year-old. We have moved to a state where we will still have these intense emotions periodically, but people are able to regulate them through effort, through purpose. And this effortful control can be stronger for kids who have very steady and steadfast self-esteem. However, those who have unrealistically high, as in they think that they are much better than they actually are, or unrealistically low, thinking they're much worse than they actually are, their effortful control can actually be less. So we would see these kids more prone to outbursts than kids who are kind of in the middle of the road of their own self-concept. Resilience, this is on slide number 10, is the capacity to adapt well despite significant adversity and to overcome serious stress. And resilience is dynamic. So some kids may have high resilience for certain situations but low resilience for others. And it's generally seen as a positive adaptation to stress. And it can be developed. Kids who do not have naturally high resilience can be given the skills to increase their resilience. On slide 11, we're starting to talk about cumulative stress. There's a lot of research that has gone into this because kids who have multiple experiences of adverse childhood events, or ACEs, within their lives, and I do mean multiple, so they have, poor family structure, exposure to violence or drugs, food insecurity, like any of these things. Once it gets to about 4 major risk factors that they deal with as a childhood, we start seeing really strong bad outcomes in their later childhood, adolescence, and even on into adulthood. And so having these accumulated stressors over time can be very devastating to kids, and cause a lot of symptomology of poor behaviors, disruptive behaviors later on in adolescence. In things where in adolescence we might look at kids who are highly at risk for delinquent behavior or whatever else and think, oh, those are bad kids, they make terrible choices. But actually these behavior problems that we're seeing are symptoms of these adverse childhood events that they experienced when they were kids. And this exposure to repeated stressors can be very damaging. We can also see, moving on to slide number 12, sometimes a single event will actually cause many different stressors to occur all at once. And so a good example of this is Hurricane Katrina or any natural disaster. And so we're looking at this chart, and with this single event, kids might have, their homes damaged by the storms, they had to move, disrupt their entire lives, separated from a primary caregiver, transferred to a new school, all new friends, lost a friend or a family member, had a parent who became unemployed, adding a new stressor into their life, was separated from a pet. And that's a lot of potential things to come from one event. And so sometimes the accumulated stressors can happen all at once, or sometimes they can kind of be added on over a period of time. Either way, we're going to have to start looking at coping measures and how we can help children cope with and be resilient against these sorts of stressors in their lives in order to minimize those later negative outcomes that I was talking about. Some of the coping measures that can help reduce this repeated stress, this is on slide 13, will be to focus on the interpretation of the family situation. And so kids think about, what does this actually mean? Developing friends, activities, skills, participating in school success and after-school activities, being involved in community, church, and other programs, and basically having pockets of security within their lives in which they can do well. There are adults around them who care about them. There are peers around them that they can get along well with. And then basically to kind of help them process through all of these different issues that they might be experiencing. On slide 14, 15, and 16, we are talking about shared and non-shared environments. This is one of those issues in which kids who grow up together, siblings, right, they oftentimes we think about them, well, I grew up in the same family and therefore they had basically the same experience. But of course, we know that that's not the case when we think about it. There are certain things that they will share with each other, but certain things that will be non-shared. So if something happens to the entire family, they move, a parent changes job, they file for divorce, the family's economic status, like those sorts of things happen to and around everyone within the family. However, the non-shared individual influences within that. Kids do different things after school, they have different friends, but also they're different ages. They have different natural resiliency. So even if they're experiencing something that everyone in the family experiences, there's a move, there's a divorce, an older child is going to have a different experience than a younger child. A child who is more naturally resilient is going to have a different experience than a child who is more naturally vulnerable to these sorts of stressors. And then if something happens at school, in this classroom but not in this classroom, or with this group of friends but not with this group of friends, they're going to have different experiences throughout their lives. And that's basically the difference with the shared and the non-shared environments. It's important to keep in mind that part of these non-shared environments really just have to do with how old people are, where they fall within the family, the roles that they play in the family, the expectations that are given. There might be different experiences for boys versus girls, for the oldest child versus the second oldest child. You know, all sorts of different things like that can influence whether an environment is fully shared or non-shared. On slide 17, we have the family structure and family function. So the structure would be the legal and genetic relationship. These are the nuclear family, the parents, the children, the aunties, the uncles, the step family, like the different roles, relationships that we have, right? But then the family function is how all of these different roles and identities work together in order to provide the basic material needs, encourage learning, help development of self-respect, nurture friendships, foster harmony and stability, and the extent to which they do all of these things well with each other in any sort of like shared or equal, equitable sort of relationship. Some families function better than other families function, and it doesn't have very much to do with the actual structure of the family. If it's, you know, two parents and two kids, depending on who those two parents are and depending on who those two kids are, the actual function of the structure could be very different from one household to another. Starting at slide 19, we go over a number of different family structures that are common today. The nuclear family with father, mother, and their biological children has been considered our traditional norm within society. However, I do want to point out that this is relatively recent history that this is considered the norm within our society. Before we moved into the industrial era, where people were moving into cities in order to get work, we typically would have people living in smaller communities where all of their extended family were very nearby and very possibly under the same roof, or living next door to each other. And so the traditional structure of the family would be parents and biological children, but also grandparents and aunties and uncles and cousins, and this entire body of people and relations that worked together in order to raise the kids and make the decisions and all of these different things. And it was a very different sort of structure, but also there were a lot of different supports that were available for every single member of this family. So even within this, you know, if you have like the wife who's taking care of the family, taking care of the home, well, they also have sisters and cousins and in-laws and other people who are helping them do those things. We have people who are taking care of the children. Again, there's multiple adults who are involved in that process. We have people who are earning money. There are multiple adults involved in that process, and kids as a matter of fact at the time. However, when when families started moving into cities in order to get jobs, it became this like much smaller structure with parents and children and nobody else. And that suddenly meant that these two adults became responsible for things that had previously been the responsibility of half a dozen adults, and those two adults are now expected to be everything to each other in a way that they were not really expected to be everything to each other before. And so now they're friends and partners, and they have to come up with all sorts of decisions and lots of things that are still relatively newly expected within a romantic marriage relationship within the United States. And so, yeah, this idea, I just want to put it into some historical context because, of course, the idea of the nuclear family is starting to go by the wayside. We do see still currently that people who are in a nuclear family with two parents and their children tend to be wealthier, better educated, healthier, more flexible, less hostile. But the reason for this is that when we see a nuclear family where two people got married and then later chose to develop a family with kids and everything later on, they tend to be better prepared for it. They tend to opt into having kids, for example. Whereas on the next slide, when we see a single parent family, and this is not always the case, but it certainly can be the case, where a pregnancy happened when a relationship between two adults wasn't necessarily very stable, or maybe they didn't even really know each other, and so it tends to be more by accident, or at least there is certainly a number of people within that case for whom they were not necessarily prepared or wanting to have kids. There's also the case, of course, of where there had been that strong nuclear family, but then the relationship just didn't work out. And now that we have divorce pretty commonly in this country, if there's a bad relationship, people can walk away from it, and I think that's a good thing. But now we're seeing like this increase in single parent households. And there can be income issues with that, even when it started with two people together who are in a relatively stable financial place. When they split up, the process of the divorce can sometimes cause financial instability, which can then have an impact on, the child's development and just the entire family's outcome. The extended family would include like the parents and relatives and in-laws and all of that. Sometimes we are moving more toward reintegration of extended family. Part of that has to do with housing is becoming more and more expensive, and wages are not growing the same way that housing is growing in cost. And so we are more likely to see people living with grandparents in the home. We also are starting to see more, at least on reality TV, of like polyamorous families, specifically like the Mormon or some sort of tradition like that, where there's one man and several wives and the biological children of all of these partners. It's still illegal in the United States, but we are starting to see some other like polyamorous families, at least, I don't know, on TV. We have our adoptive and foster parent families and step-parent families. Adoptive and foster parent families tend to function well and often better than nuclear families. This is specifically the case for gay and lesbian adoptions because, again, it's opted into. These are couples that have been together and who tried really hard in order to, go through all the paperwork and bureaucracy and everything else in order to have children, and so they are ready and for it. There's no like accidental oopsies in a gay and lesbian family. And with step-parent families, this can be very difficult, and it depends on the parents, and it depends on the children, it depends on the ages, it depends on previous circumstances and circumstances that arise after the family is kind of newly formed their alliance. So there's a lot of difficulties that definitely can come in with step-parent families. It's hard, and I think that it's worth it for us to understand and be mindful of how that can be very difficult, particularly when they do have different ideas about how to raise kids, and that process has already begun. Yeah. On slide 26, there's this graph looking at family conflict, and I find this to be particularly interesting based on where I come from. Low income, high conflict families, the conflict tends to come from that financial stress, and then of course the conflict may actually increase financial stress. It can go back and forth, but it certainly can affect the family's structure and function. The effects of poverty are cumulative and oftentimes can become exacerbated over time and even across generations. And so the low SES may be difficult for kids. Within this era, we're talking about kids who are developing that higher materialism and social comparison, and then so recognizing I am going without where other kids have, so that can be difficult. In a high income but also high conflict family, we tend to see parents putting a lot of pressure on their children to excel and to excel really well, sometimes to pick up their own dreams that they may not have achieved quite as well, or just to excel, to continue to bring honor and whatnot to the family. So the types of difficulties that we see with kids in these high income, high conflict families are drug use, typically like the higher designer drugs, cocaine and expensive things, delinquency, and poor academic issues. However, I do want to note that the delinquency that they see within our criminal justice system is punished less harshly. They're less likely to do any sort of jail time for the same types of violence or fights or drug use or abuse or sales or whatever than we do see with low income kids who are using basically these same behaviors. But low income and particularly minority children who are picked up for these exact same crimes, well, they're more likely to be picked up, they're more likely to be charged, and then they're more likely to be harshly sentenced. So, yeah. I'm skipping forward here to slide number 29. This is the culture of children, which is one of these fun things. There's the particular habits, styles, and values that reflect the set of rules and rituals that characterize children as distinct from adult society. Kids have all sorts of rules that they make up and that you must follow, and this is how you be friends with somebody, and this is the nature of the game, and if this person does this, then they're not going to do this. And it's the same, like in some ways the same type of intrigue that adults still have within their lives. We have our own social rules as well, but it's different. They are operating differently from us, and so they figure out how to be good friends, how to show and find social acceptance, what to do with unpopular children, how to be aware of what's happening with others. And if you work with kids or you're around kids a lot, you can see like some of these rules, they come out. It's fascinating. Oh, I just love them. On the next slide, slide 30, we have some examples that we might see characterizing a culture of children. So the fashion, the language that they use, any slang or jokes, their peer culture, attitudes, independence from adults. They're starting to move away from that needing to have constant adult supervision and approval. Moving into friendships on slide 31, they start to divide off into, boys and girls cliques, and we start to see gender differences, or I shouldn't say we continue to see gender differences in the way that kids interact. And part of this is learned, like girls have been taught at this point for, a decade, no, you don't fight, that's what boys do, and boys are taught, oh yeah, boys will be boys, and so they figure out different ways in order to appropriately interact with each other. We start to see girls talking more and sharing secrets, boys playing more active games, and so the way that they interact are starting to develop toward those more adult standards and norms that they're seeing in the culture around them. The older that kids get, on slide 32, they begin to demand more of their friends, more time from their friends. They change friends less often. Once they've picked like their best friend or their best few friends, they stick with them over time. And they become more upset when a new friendship or when a friendship ends than with younger children. They start finding it harder to make new friends, and they seek out friends who have their own interests and values. Moving forward into bullying and the bully victim. So bullying is any sort of repeated systematic effort to inflict harm through physical, verbal, social attack on a weaker person. It is purposeful, it is intentful, right? The bully victim will be someone who attacks others but who is also attacked. And so they find themselves in that position of sometimes they are the victim, and in order to recover from that, make themselves feel better, feel strong, they are bullies to others as well. Oftentimes, though, this can also be a provocative victim who does things specifically to elicit bullying. So like picking on somebody who will pick back, and so they're victimizing the person who is going to victimize them. It can be complicated, but yeah, we do see this. On page 35, we have these 4 different types of bullying that we see. Physical, which would be, hitting, pinching, kicking, etc. Verbal, teasing, taunting, or name-calling. Relational, destroying peer relationships and acceptance and friendship. And then cyberbullying, using any sort of electronic means to harm other people through texting or social media. And there's this question on slide 36, who suffers more? We see violent attacks more likely, the physical bullying with boys. We see relational and verbal attacks more with girls. And we see verbal as well with boys. And then the cyberbullying is, the research is still new, but we're seeing a number of different types arising with boys or girls. And the long and short of it is, all forms of bullying can cause harm and can cause significant harm. And so it's important for us to look at all of these things. Even if it doesn't leave physical scars, it can still leave difficulties for the child on the long term. Moving on to slide 38, some of the causes and consequences of bullying. So sometimes, yes, there's a genetic predisposition or brain abnormality, but typically what we're seeing is something within the environment. So this would be the parenting or caregiving environment, some experience that the child has already had, experiences that they have with peers that lead them to believe that the behavior that they are conducting is normal or makes them feel strong or helps them cope with something. And it's not a strong, good, positive coping, but sometimes we do see that when kids feel insecure in certain areas, they lash out in others in order to feel as though they have control. So obviously, in those cases, we would need to find a better coping strategy to help them deal with whatever else is going on within their lives. Consequences of bullying may be like an impaired social standing, lower school achievement, relationship difficulties, and depression. And this is for both the bully and the victim. People tend not to like bullies because they're bullies, but also people who are victims of bullying tend to have these same issues as well. One of the things that we find with the successful elimination of bullying is it has to be the entire school that's involved. There can't just be a go to the counselor or go to the principal or just this one person that is sent, that everybody is sent to if there is some sort of involvement. It has to be a widespread intervention where everybody gets on board to eliminate this issue of bullying. And it's really important to evaluate the results of any anti-bullying campaign, because certain things will be useful in certain situations but less useful in other situations. And if we're not able to identify what is working best here, what can we do better, then any small chink in the armor of that of that bullying intervention can kind of cause it to collapse. So the ongoing assessment of how effective it is can be very beneficial. So we're moving into, on slide 39, Kohlberg's levels of moral thought. So kids throughout middle childhood are moving from pre-conventional toward post-conventional. Pre-conventional moral reasoning, you see this with little kids. If I do bad, I will get in trouble. If I do good, I will be rewarded. And that's their morality, right? So Santa Claus will bring me presents and God will bless me, and that's why they want to do good, and they don't want to do bad because they don't want time out or, get a lump of coal or whatever else. And so that's the morality that we see in small kids. In middle childhood, we're typically seeing a movement through like the conventional moral reasoning, which would emphasize social rules. That's not right. This is right. That's not fair. You hear that a lot in middle childhood. This strong focus on fairness, and so they've learned that there are certain things that are okay and are not okay, but that understanding, the moral reasoning that they have is still very black and white. You shouldn't lie. Lies are bad, but there's no sense of, okay, well, when lies might be good, or when lies, when someone might want to have a lie of omission. How is that? I mean, it's not fully there just yet. And so they also tend to be very strong in these beliefs and not accepting of compromise. And we see this kind of lasting into adolescence as we're moving toward the post-conventional moral reasoning, which is emphasizing moral principles. So starting to get into okay, that's not right, but why is it not right? What's the actual purpose? What does it cause? What harm does it cause? What are the outcomes if everybody did this? And so really starting to suss through the hows and whys of things being good or bad, or evil or moral or immoral, ethical or unethical. Most kids in middle childhood, though, are going to be somewhere along the lines of the emphasizing social rules, where the black and white, right or wrong, and no shades of gray in between. And I'm going to stop there for our chapter 13, and I'll see you guys next week. If you have any questions about any of these chapters or about your test for next week, please let me know. It's going to be the same structure as our previous test that we used, so you're prepared for it in that sense, and I'll see you next week.